Hello, my dear literature enthusiasts, and welcome back. It's always such a joy to have you here, especially when we're diving into something mysterious, layered, and rich with meaning. You know how we love to look at films not as mere entertainment, but as texts, living, breathing narratives that deserve the same respect we give to a great novel or a timeless poem. So before we start, I'll ask just one thing, in the most sincere way I know how. If you find yourself drawn in by these conversations, if they spark your curiosity or open a window to a new perspective, please consider liking this video and subscribing. It helps us keep building this little community of thinkers, dreamers, and seekers. Now, I want to be perfectly clear from the start. This is not a conventional movie review. What we're about to embark on is a deeply intellectual, theoretical, and critical exploration, meant especially for those with a literature background or at least a love of the kind of thought that digs beneath the surface. Think of this as sitting down together with a cup of tea, or maybe something stronger, on a quiet evening, and letting the conversation wander from the tangible to the symbolic, from what is seen to what is suggested. The film at the center of tonight's discussion is Triangle, 2009, and it's one that's stayed with me for years, lingering in the corners of my mind like an unanswered question. I first stumbled upon it in the most unassuming way, late at night, half-tired, not really looking for anything in particular. You know those moments when you tell yourself, just 10 minutes, and suddenly the clock has stolen hours from you? That's how it happened. And yet, this wasn't the kind of film you can just casually watch. Even from the first few scenes, it whispered that it wanted more from me: attention, patience, trust. I found myself leaning in, not just to see what would happen next, but to try to catch the subtleties hiding between lines of dialogue, in glances, in silences. On the surface, the story starts with a simple premise. A group of friends head out on a sailing trip, and something goes wrong. But simple is deceptive here, because from the moment they encounter a mysterious, seemingly abandoned ocean liner, the rules of time, reality, and identity begin to bend in ways that defy easy explanation. What begins as survival horror quietly reveals itself to be something much stranger, something almost literary in its structure, a kind of Mobius strip of narrative where every twist seems to fold back into itself. I won't spoil all the turns, though the truth is, this isn't a film you can truly spoil, because its power isn't in the shock of the events themselves but in the way it reconfigures them in your mind. That said, I will tease just enough. Imagine a world where actions repeat, but not quite in the same way, where characters walk into moments they half remember, where fate seems like both a chain and a choice. And at the center, a woman whose decisions, desperate, flawed, human, become the engine of an endlessly looping tragedy. What really gripped me was how it forced me to think about guilt, not in a distant philosophical sense, but in the raw, messy way we all carry it. The film doesn't hand us a clear answer about whether the characters are victims of circumstance, punishment, or their own choices. Instead, it mirrors the way memory works, fractured, contradictory, stitched together from scraps we'd rather forget. Watching it felt a little like reading Faulkner or Woolf, where time refuses to behave, where the interior life of a character can stretch and warp reality itself. I have to admit, this hit me personally. I've had moments in my own life where I felt caught in a loop, replaying mistakes in my mind, convinced that if I could just go back and do it differently, everything would change. But, of course, life rarely offers that clean slate. And here, the film almost cruelly suggests that even if we could start over, we might still find ourselves making the same choices, for the same reasons, trapped not by circumstance but by who we are. It's unsettling, and yet oddly comforting? Perhaps because it acknowledges something true, that we are all, in some way, bound by our nature. The pacing is worth noting too. It doesn't rush to reveal its secrets, and I love that. There's a certain confidence in a story that takes its time, letting you wander through confusion before rewarding you with clarity, or at least, a deeper kind of mystery. The cinematography helps with that. Lingering shots of corridors, vast open seas, and the oppressive, maze-like ship interior. They feel less like settings and more like psychological landscapes, as if the protagonist isn't just lost at sea, but lost in herself. If you're the kind of person who reads a novel and immediately wants to talk about motifs, symbols, and recurring images, this film will feel like home. The repetition of certain moments, subtle changes each time, works almost like refrains in poetry, altering meaning with each return. There's also a recurring use of objects that function like literary symbols. A dropped key, a bloodstained shirt, a mysterious note. Each one asks you to assign it meaning, even as the film resists giving you a definitive answer. What I admire most, though, is that it doesn't underestimate its audience. It trusts us to keep up, to hold multiple possibilities in our heads at once, to question what we've seen and what we think we know. It's a kind of narrative generosity I don't often see, an invitation to participate rather than passively consume. And for those of us who live for that kind of engagement, who find joy in being a little lost before finding our way, it's an absolute gift. By the end, I felt that curious mixture of satisfaction and yearning that only certain stories can give you. Satisfaction because the pieces do fit together, if not neatly, then at least with deliberate design. Yearning because it leaves spaces unfilled, gaps where your own thoughts can settle, like dust in a long-closed room. That's the thing, some films give you answers. Others give you the tools to start asking better questions. And for me, this one falls firmly into the second category. When the credits rolled, I stayed in my seat, just listening to the sound of my own breathing. Not because I was frightened, though there is a quiet horror in what unfolds, but because I was reluctant to return to the ordinary world. There's a strange intimacy in spending 2 hours inside a mind so different from your own, and yet finding echoes of yourself there. It's not always comfortable, but it's always worthwhile. So, to those of you who appreciate the layers beneath the plot, who read films the way others read literature, who find beauty in ambiguity, this is a story worth your time. It won't hold your hand, it won't explain itself neatly, and it certainly won't leave you unchanged. And perhaps that's the greatest compliment I can give. Not that it entertains, but that it lingers. That it becomes, in some small way, part of the way you see the world. And that, to me, is the whole point of cinema at its best, not to distract us from life, but to return. And that, to me, is the whole point of cinema at its best, not to distract us from life, but to return us to it with sharper eyes, fuller hearts, and just a touch more curiosity about the mysteries we live in every day. There's a certain kind of morning that feels like it's promising you nothing unusual at all. The kind that seems to whisper, "Don't worry, today will be just another day." That's how it begins. We're introduced to a woman who moves through her kitchen as if she's still half in a dream. The light is soft, almost too soft, as if it's trying to hide something. She's with her young son, preparing for what should be an ordinary day. But even in these first quiet moments, there's something slightly out of step. A distracted look in her eyes. The faintest edge in her voice when she urges him to get ready. She's dressed casually, but not without care, and there's a nervous energy to her movements. I remember noticing how the camera didn't just show her. It seemed to study her, waiting for her to give something away. There's love between her and her boy. That much is clear, but it's threaded with a tension you can't quite name yet. She pauses for a moment, looking out at the day ahead as if she's bracing herself. And then the scene shifts and we're pulled into something new. She's driving, making her way to a small marina. The sunlight on the water has that blinding midday shimmer, and a few other people are already there, preparing a yacht for a sailing trip. It's a mixed group, friends, acquaintances, maybe some who are meeting for the first time. There's easy laughter among some, polite introductions among others. The woman joins them, explaining she's running late because of her son. You can sense a few curious glances, the way people look when they're trying to place someone in the social puzzle of a group. One of the men, clearly the one hosting the trip, greets her warmly. He's the kind of person who seems comfortable at sea, both in the literal sense and in the sense of moving through social waters. They board the yacht, start loosening ropes, preparing for what looks like a perfect day for sailing. The mood is light but not frivolous. There's an unspoken undercurrent, a feeling that this gathering matters for reasons we don't yet know. Once they're underway, there's that intoxicating sense of openness you get when the coastline starts to shrink behind you. The wind is good, the conversation flows easily, and yet little fissures appear. She sits quietly at times, staring at the water, almost too quiet for someone on a friendly outing. Someone offers her a drink, but she hesitates before accepting. When she does speak, it's often with a kind of guarded politeness, as though she's holding back pieces of herself. And then the weather shifts. Not gradually, but suddenly, like someone flipping a switch. The horizon darkens in a way that feels wrong, fast, unnatural. The wind picks up with a sharpness that isn't just brisk, it's biting. Before long, the boat is being battered by a storm that feels far larger than the vessel is meant to handle. Rain lashes down, waves slam against the hull, voices rise in panic. Orders are shouted, grab the ropes, hold tight, secure what you can, but the sea is deafening. It's chaos. Water crashes over the deck, the yacht tilts dangerously, and for a moment you wonder if they'll survive at all. In the middle of it, there's a shot of her clutching the railing, her face set in grim determination, not fear. It's as if she's been here before, or at least somewhere like it, in another storm in another life. When the violence of the storm finally begins to ebb, they're left with a ruin of calm. The sea is eerily still, the kind of stillness that feels like it's holding its breath. The yacht is damaged badly, and one of the group is gone. The silence that follows is thick, weighted by the shock of survival and the unanswered question of what just happened. Then, out of the haze, something appears. A massive ocean liner, sliding across the water toward them. Its sheer size makes their yacht look like a toy. It's an imposing sight, old-fashioned, almost regal, but with an emptiness to it, as if it's a ghost of itself. They call out, wave their arms, desperate for help, but there's no visible movement on deck. Still, they decide they have no choice but to board it. As they approach, the details become sharper. Polished metal railings, wide staircases, Art Deco lines. It's strangely well kept for something seemingly abandoned. They clamber aboard, wet and exhausted, calling into the vastness of its corridors. Their voices echo back at them in ways that make the ship feel alive, responsive in its silence. Here, the mood shifts again. The danger of the storm is gone, but the tension hasn't left, it's just changed shape. The woman is the first to seem unsettled. She walks slower, scanning the hallways like someone looking for a half-remembered room. At one point, she stops completely, tilting her head as if listening for something only she can hear. They move deeper inside, exploring the grand dining halls, the labyrinthine corridors. It's pristine yet devoid of people. Food is laid out in the dining area, fresh and untouched, as though guests might walk in at any moment. There's a faint smell of something warm in the air, baked bread maybe. This is the part that stayed with me the most. That strange, deliberate dissonance between the signs of life and the absence of life. It's like walking into a novel where every room is a metaphor for something you haven't yet understood. One of the group jokes nervously about the ship being haunted, but no one laughs. The woman keeps looking around with that same faint recognition, like she's tracing invisible lines in the air. She begins to move ahead of the others, drawn down corridors that feel narrower than they should, past mirrors that seem to linger on her reflection just a moment too long. Then, almost without warning, things begin to happen that make less and less sense. Footsteps that don't belong to anyone in their party. The sound of something metallic clattering to the floor somewhere out of sight. A fleeting glimpse of movement far down a hallway. Too far to identify, but unmistakably human. The group tries to stay together, but the ship seems to have its own plans, leading them into different spaces, pulling them apart. At one point, she finds something strange. A dropped object, a set of keys, that looks oddly familiar to her. She pockets it without telling the others, her face unreadable. And it's here that. Didn't know you had. And in that moment, the dread deepens, not just because of the impossibility, but because she knows what's coming. There's no time to make sense of it. No time to shout a warning or run to intercept. Events begin to unfurl again, eerily similar to what she's already lived. The group boards the ship, wet, disoriented, looking for help, and she watches from the shadows unseen. They move through the same corridors, call out into the same empty halls, marvel at the same untouched food in the dining room. Every detail lands with the awful weight of déjà vu, and she knows where it's leading. Here's the first truth she can't avoid. She's part of a pattern, and the pattern is cruel. The masked figure will appear again. People will die again. And unless something changes, she'll be watching her own tragedy replay itself endlessly. The realization doesn't break her, it steals her. She grips her weapon tighter, moving quickly now, trying to position herself ahead of the events she's already seen. She tells herself she can save them this time. She has to. She tracks the masked figure through the ship's labyrinthine hallways, darting between cover, breath sharp and quick. When she finally catches the attacker off guard, there's a violent struggle, shouts, the clang of metal, the thud of bodies hitting the floor. She manages to land a blow, hard enough to drop them. And here, the story delivers one of its most chilling moments. The mask slips away, and she finds herself staring into her own face. The shock is immediate but not clean. It's not just that she's seeing herself. It's that some part of her knew this was coming. The body on the floor is unmistakably hers, down to the smallest scar. There's no time to process the why or the how. The other her is wounded but not dead, crawling away, disappearing into the corridors. And in that fractured second, our protagonist realizes something even worse. She's not the first to be here in this role trying to change the ending. It's a revelation that hits like cold water. If she's not the first, then maybe she's also not the last. This isn't a clean loop with one version of herself. It's a chain of them, overlapping, chasing and being chased. And each is desperate enough to kill. The logic of it is slippery, but the emotional truth is razor-sharp. She's trapped in a cycle where she becomes both victim and perpetrator, savior and executioner. She throws herself back into the chase, desperate to reach her friends before the attacker, before her other self, can get to them. But even as she runs, she's noticing things, marks on the walls, discarded objects, signs that this sequence has played out countless times before. A blood-stained shirt, identical to the one she's wearing. A pile of the same necklace, repeated over and over. She's not looking at random debris. She's looking at the sediment of repetition, the physical proof of endless failure. When the violence begins again, when the first of her friends falls, it's like watching a tragedy she's already read in a book she can't put down. She tries to intervene, shoving someone out of the way, shouting warnings, but her actions only twist events in small ways. Deaths still happen, just not quite in the same order. She begins to understand the cruel mechanics of this place. The loop doesn't reset until everyone else is gone. By the time she's the last one left alive again, she's cornered by the other her. The version she had seen earlier in the mask. There's a fight, brutal and ungraceful, the kind born of survival rather than skill. She wins barely. The masked version falls over the railing into the ocean below. The splash is distant, almost muted by the heavy stillness that follows. For a moment she stands there, shaking, thinking she's done it, that she's broken the cycle. But the ocean doesn't let her go. The sound of water shifts, the air sharpens, and she finds herself looking toward the horizon again. There, impossibly, is the yacht, her yacht, cutting through the water with its familiar passengers. The loop has tightened its grip. She watches the scene replay again, the boat approaching, the laughter, the boarding. Only now there's no room for doubt. She is the masked figure next time. The cycle doesn't end when you kill your double. It ends when you become her. Somewhere deep inside, she decides that maybe the only way to end it is to go all the way through, to finish it decisively. The scenes that follow are haunting in their inevitability. She stalks the group in the mask, replaying the attacks she once fled from, pushing events toward their bloody conclusion. It's an awful transformation to witness. Not because she becomes monstrous, but because she never stops being human. Every act of violence is tinged with desperation, with the faint hope that this time it will change something. And then it's done. Everyone else is gone. The ship grows eerily quiet again. She staggers to the edge, peering down into the water where the yacht had been, and there, like clockwork, is the moment that resets everything. The ocean swallows the scene, and she finds herself adrift until she wakes on the shore. But here's the cruelest twist. She wakes not in safety, but in her own life, stepping back into the morning we saw before. She walks into her home, the sun streaming through the same windows, her young son there as if nothing has happened. The familiarity is unbearable now. She moves through the rooms with an almost mechanical precision, knowing exactly where every object is, what every moment holds. It's not comfort, it's the horror of inevitability. Something in her snaps. She grabs her son, urging him into the car, saying they're leaving, they're starting over. There's panic in her voice now, but also conviction, as though she believes this is the one variable she can still control. She drives fast, too fast, her eyes darting to the mirrors, her hands gripping the wheel. The sunlight on the road is blinding, the world ahead almost shimmering with possibility, or maybe with warning. And then it happens. A sudden violent crash. The sound is metallic, shattering. The car spins, the world flips. When it stops, she's outside herself for a moment, looking at the wreckage as though it belongs to someone else. Her son lies still. The road is littered with glass. The smell of gasoline hangs heavy in the air. She's trembling, murmuring words we can't quite hear, as if she's making promises to a God she doesn't believe in. In the next breath, she's standing at the roadside, watching a tow truck haul the wrecked car away. A taxi pulls up, its arrival almost too perfectly timed. The driver asks if she needs a lift, and she nods, climbing in without hesitation. She tells him to take her to the marina. The sunlight on the water is the same as before, the same as always. And with that, the loop closes once again. She steps onto the yacht as if it's the first time, greeted by familiar faces, smiles, introductions. The same jokes are told, the same lines exchanged. She plays her part, though her eyes are heavier now, as if carrying the weight of every repetition. Out beyond the marina, the sea waits, already knowing exactly what's to come. The story leaves us here, not with a solution, not with a neat unraveling of its mysteries, but with the unshakable sense that some fates are self-perpetuating and some cycles have no exit. It's not just a horror of being trapped in time, it's the more intimate horror of being trapped in yourself. And that's the part that lingers. Not the violence, not the supernatural mechanics, but the quiet tragedy of a person endlessly chasing redemption in the same narrow corridors, never realizing that the shape of the maze is her own shadow. The story might be bound together by its twisting corridors and relentless loops, but the true gravity holding it all in place comes from the characters, fragile, flawed, and entirely human in their fear and decisions. They aren't chess pieces moving on a board, they're living, breathing contradictions. Watching them, you get the sense that every choice, every hesitation, is rooted in a lifetime you only glimpse in flashes. At the center is her, the woman whose presence shapes every turn the story takes. She's not the sort of protagonist who arrives bathed in heroic certainty. From the very first scene, there's a subtle fissure in her composure. She moves through the world like someone who has learned to keep her vulnerabilities hidden in plain sight, who has built an armor not of bravado, but of quiet detachment. And yet, beneath it, there's a constant hum of tension, as if she's always half preparing for something terrible. What's fascinating is that she exists in two modes at once. The person she appears to be for the group, and the person she is when no one's watching. In the social context of the yacht trip, she's polite, self-contained, not eager to be the center of attention. She laughs when prompted, answers questions simply, avoids elaboration. But once the storm hits, the mask slips, and we see someone who reacts not just with fear, but with an unsettling focus. It's as though the chaos activates a part of her that was always there, one that knows how to survive in hostile territory. Her complexity deepens once the repetition begins. We watch her become both the witness and the perpetrator of the events aboard the ship. This dual role isn't just a plot device, it's a psychological excavation. She is literally confronted with herself, and the confrontation is not noble, not cathartic, but violent and merciless. She kills herself, is killed by herself, saves herself, fails herself. The loop forces her to inhabit every moral position possible, blurring the lines between victimhood and guilt until they're indistinguishable. And here's where she becomes more than a genre protagonist. She starts to feel like a stand-in for the way we all revisit our own regrets. She tries to fix things with each cycle, to prevent deaths, to steer the story toward a better ending. But the harder she tries, the more the cycle resists her, as though the problem isn't the sequence of events, but her place in them. It's this cruel symmetry, the inevitability of her becoming the very danger she's trying to stop, that elevates her beyond the framework of the plot and turns her into a haunting study in self-repetition. Her relationship to guilt is especially rich. There's an undercurrent of something unresolved in her life outside the ship, suggested in her interactions with her son, in her moments of hesitation when others speak to her. That guilt doesn't disappear when the loop starts. It becomes the fuel for her decisions. It's why she throws herself into saving people even when logic says she can't. It's why she fights herself as if defeating that other version might erase everything that came before. But guilt is a stubborn kind of gravity. It pulls her back into the same orbit no matter how far she runs. The others in the group, though less central, are not without depth. They are drawn with the kind of precision that makes them instantly recognizable types, each the kind of person you might encounter on a real trip with friends, but not so broadly that they become caricatures. The host of the outing, for instance, is friendly and affable, the kind of man who seems to take responsibility for everyone's comfort without asking for recognition. He's the one who greets her warmly at the dock, who seems to want this day to be a memory worth keeping. Yet even he is caught in the same fate, his leadership no shield against the ship's cruel design. There's the flirtatious couple, warm toward each other, but perhaps a little performative about it in front of others. They're quick with jokes and affectionate teasing, serving as the lightness before the storm literally and metaphorically hits. Their dynamic offers a brief glimpse of normalcy, a reminder of the world beyond the ship. But when the danger begins, their closeness becomes a vulnerability. Their instinct is to protect each other first, which often puts them at greater risk. Another passenger is more reserved, analytical, the sort of person who keeps watch over group dynamics without inserting himself too much. He has a sharpness about him, not cruel but observant. He seems to notice her silence early on, perhaps even suspects she's holding something back. In a different story, he might have been the one to piece together the mystery, but here, observation isn't enough to change the outcome. Each of these secondary characters serves as both a companion and a mirror for her. They represent different facets of humanity under pressure: protectiveness, adaptability, humor as a defense, caution as a strategy. And yet, because of the loop, they also become fixed points, repeating their roles no matter how the details shift. This repetition makes them feel almost like archetypes in a myth, figures bound to act out their parts, over and over, without awareness of the script they're trapped in. It's telling that as the cycles repeat, her emotional connection to them doesn't diminish. If anything, it sharpens. She becomes increasingly desperate to protect them, not because she believes it will finally free her, but because she can't bear the thought of watching them die again. This deepens her tragedy. She remembers every death, every scream, every failed attempt to intervene, but they start fresh each time, meeting her with the same easy camaraderie, unaware of the history she carries in her head. And then there's her other self, the masked version. This isn't just a villain, in the conventional sense. It's the physical embodiment of her darkest impulses, her survival at any cost, stripped of hesitation. The mask is a clever device here. It hides her face, turning her into an almost anonymous predator, but when it's pulled away, we realize it's not anonymity at all, it's intimacy. She is hunting herself, fearing herself, and ultimately becoming herself. The masked figure is what she will be, inevitably, and that inevitability is more frightening than any faceless enemy could be. Their encounters are brutal not because of the choreography, but because of what they reveal: that fighting her other self is futile. Every strike, every wound is inflicted on a body that is, in some sense, her own. It's a fight she can't win without losing, and yet she engages in it again and again, as though muscle memory has taken over and refuses to let go. Even her son, though he appears only briefly, is a quiet anchor in this storm. He represents the life she wants to return to, the piece of the world she believes she can still save. But he also represents the weight she's carrying, the guilt, the unfinished business. It's never spelled out exactly what has happened between them before the trip, but the fact that her thoughts return to him, even in the middle of chaos, tells us that this isn't just a story about escaping a supernatural trap. It's about trying and failing to escape the consequences of who you are in the moments that matter most. By the time the story folds in on itself for the final time, the characters have taken on an almost literary quality. They're no longer just individuals in a horror thriller. They're symbols in a meditation on fate and selfhood. She is Sisyphus pushing her boulder up the hill, only to watch it roll back down. The others are the landscape of her struggle, the constants against which her changing strategies are measured. The masked self is the eternal return of the same, the proof that in trying to outrun herself, she's only running in circles. And yet, even knowing this, she never stops trying. That's what keeps her human in the midst of all this repetition. She doesn't resign herself to the loop, even when she understands its rules better than anyone. She clings to the idea that there's a version of events where she gets it right, even if that version is always out of reach. It's a small, stubborn hope, and it's the thread that makes her story more than a nightmare. It makes it a tragedy, and tragedies, at their best, are where we find the deepest truths about ourselves. There's a certain kind of magic in learning the little, tucked-away truths about a film you've already wandered through in your mind. The story you see on screen is only half the tale. The other half hides in the quiet corridors of its making, where accidents turn into art, strange coincidences ripple through the production, and choices, both deliberate and instinctive, leave fingerprints on every frame. One of the most fascinating things is how this film's structure wasn't simply born from a clever script draft. It was sculpted through constant questioning and reshaping. The writer-director was said to have carried the seed of the idea for years, returning to it like a looping dream, each time layering in more psychological depth. The narrative's circular design wasn't an afterthought, it was the skeleton. Entire sequences were blocked and reblocked not because of technical errors, but to test whether the audience could sense the repetition without fully naming it until later. In other words, the puzzle wasn't just in the story, it was built into the very process of making it. What's especially curious is how the ocean itself became a character in ways no one fully planned. The film was shot partly on water, and the sea is not a cooperative stage. One day, while filming what was supposed to be a placid, sunny scene, the weather shifted so quickly it seemed as though nature had read ahead in the script. A calm blue horizon turned charcoal in less than an hour, and the wind hit so hard that the yacht scenes had to be completely rethought. Rather than fight it, the crew leaned in. That sudden squall fed directly into the film's foreboding mood, proof that sometimes the best set design is whatever the day decides to give you. The massive ocean liner, of course, wasn't drifting out at sea waiting to be boarded. It was recreated through a blend of location shoots and set construction. The exterior shots came from a real cruise vessel, but much of the interior, those grand corridors, echoing dining halls, and maze-like staircases, were built on soundstages deliberately designed to be just a little off. The production designer played with symmetry and perspective, so that even in moments of calm, the audience would feel slightly unsettled without knowing why. Hallways were sometimes made a few feet narrower than standard, doors were fractionally taller, mirrors placed to reflect empty spaces instead of characters. Tiny manipulations that left the human brain quietly uneasy. One strange, almost superstitious habit emerged among the crew. Because of the film's looping structure and the eerie coincidences on set, some members began referring to the project as the curse, half joking but not entirely without belief. A few people claimed to have recurring dreams while working on it, dreams about being late to set, only to arrive and find they'd already filmed the day's scenes without them. The repetition in the story seemed to be seeping into their subconscious, as though the fiction had a way of pulling real life into its orbit. Even the casting process had its odd turns. The lead role demanded someone who could carry both vulnerability and a kind of unshakable resolve. When the actress who ultimately took it on auditioned, she reportedly delivered one scene in two completely different ways. Once as a terrified survivor, and once as someone already complicit in the events. This duality became a cornerstone of the performance, and the director later admitted that without that reading, the whole narrative might have leaned too far into either horror or mystery, instead of balancing precariously between them. Some of the most unusual production quirks came from the need to keep the film's central twist intact during shooting. Many cast members weren't given the full script at once. Instead, they received only the sections that applied to their scenes, with the rest kept under wraps. This meant that, in a sense, they were acting in partial ignorance, reacting authentically to the confusion their characters would feel. The lead actress, however, had the complete blueprint, which created a subtle hierarchy of knowledge on set. She became a quiet anchor for the others, sometimes hinting at context without explaining it, mirroring the way her character holds information back from the group. There were also practical challenges that lent themselves to strange creative solutions. For example, shooting the sequences where events repeat required precise matching of movements, camera angles, and lighting. To make this work, the crew would sometimes film a scene to completion, then immediately reset everything and shoot again from the perspective of another loop. This demanded almost unnatural attention to detail. Spilled coffee had to land in the same splatter, wind gusts had to be replicated with fans, and even the pace of footsteps had to be timed to the second. The repetition became so embedded in the workflow that some crew members confessed to feeling déjà vu while editing, unsure whether they were watching take 1 or take 4. One particularly strange behind-the-scenes moment came during a day of shooting in the dining hall set. The space was filled with prop food meant to look fresh and untouched, but after hours under hot lights, the scent began to change. Actors walking through the scene swore they caught the smell of real bread and coffee, comforting at first, but then oddly unsettling when they remembered it wasn't actually edible. That dissonance, something that should be nourishing but isn't, echoed the film's thematic undercurrent. The familiarity of safety, hiding the truth of danger. Another little-known detail is that some of the ship's interior signage was intentionally wrong. Directional arrows would point in contradictory ways, labels on doors were swapped between takes, and clocks would sometimes be set to times that didn't match the rest of the scene. None of this was meant to be obvious to the audience. It was there to disorient the actors just enough to affect their performances. The set became a living metaphor for the narrative's dislocation in time. Perhaps the most goosebump-inducing coincidence came late in production. While filming one of the final yacht sequences, the crew noticed another small vessel passing in the distance. Through binoculars, they saw it was a fishing boat with a painted emblem, 3 interlocking triangles. No one had arranged it, and the boat was gone before they could hail it. It became an inside joke on set that the story had called the symbol to them, as though the film itself had ways of reminding them what it was about. Even in post-production, oddities continued. The sound design team reported strange feedback during certain mixes, sharp, echoing tones that seemed to appear only in the sequences where the loop resets. Technically, it was likely some quirk of overlapping audio layers, but the team half-seriously wondered if they'd recorded something they weren't meant to hear. Rather than scrub it entirely, they left a whisper of it in, buried in the mix, as a kind of secret signature for anyone with ears sensitive enough to catch it. The editing process was its own labyrinth. Lining up the loops in a way that felt seamless, but still revealed new information each time was a delicate balance. Too much repetition and the audience would grow restless. Too little and the structure would lose its hypnotic effect. The editor worked with storyboards covered in colored strings, charting the film's beats like a detective mapping out a case. Each loop had its own color, in the edit, a private code to keep the sequences aligned without confusion. Even the costumes played into the design. The wardrobe department created duplicates of the leads' clothing in various stages of wear and damage, so the transition between loops could be tracked visually without overtly announcing itself. A tiny tear in a sleeve, a faint bloodstain, or a smudge of dirt might be the only clue the audience had that time had shifted. These details were often subtle enough to be felt rather than noticed, working subconsciously to pull viewers deeper into the spiral. What lingers about these behind-the-scenes truths is how they mirror the very story they're helping tell. A film about patterns and repetitions ended up creating patterns and repetitions in its own making. Whether looping from calm to chaos, sets repeating corridors in impossible ways, actors reliving scenes until their bodies remembered the timing without thought. It's as though the act of telling this story invited the loop into reality, if only for the months it took to bring it to life. There's a point early on when the group finds themselves aboard that eerily abandoned vessel. On the surface, this is a typical narrative beat in a suspense story. The sudden change in environment, the upgrade in stakes. But here, the emptiness isn't simply spooky. It's an invitation to examine absence itself. What does it mean to walk into a space that looks like it was just inhabited, but has been stripped of its human presence? There's an uncanny power in that, because as viewers, we're trained to read an empty setting as either a mystery to be solved or a trap waiting to be sprung. Yet the film seems to enjoy letting us hang in that tension. That's one of its most clever manipulations. It teaches us to feel unsafe without showing us the danger directly. In a way, the ship becomes the embodiment of inevitability, vast, echoing, and quietly in control. And then there's the first clear fracture in reality, that small but chilling moment when an event doesn't unfold the way it should, or when an object is found where logic says it shouldn't be. From a purely narrative perspective, this is where the film starts to reveal its true shape. But on a thematic level, it's doing something far more intimate. It's giving the viewer the unsettling experience of déjà vu without the comfort of remembering where they've seen it before. This has a dual effect. First, it forces us into the protagonist's headspace, confused, disoriented, suspicious of our own senses. Second, it primes us for the revelation that repetition will not be used as a gimmick, but as the central mechanism of the story's meaning. The violent encounters that follow are more than just the action beats that thrillers often lean on. They're moral turning points. Every time a character is harmed, or worse, there's a collision between two truths. The immediate, emotional truth of survival and the slower, more philosophical truth that survival here might mean perpetuating the very danger one is trying to escape. This is a film that makes you ask, if saving yourself guarantees harm to another, are you still innocent? And what happens when the other is another version of you? That's where it begins to press into territory that feels almost literary in its ethical complexity, reminiscent of the way great novels will trap their characters in moral loops that strip away easy answers. One of the most striking events is the first time the protagonist realizes she's not alone in the way she thought she was. The subtle reveal that something is off not just in time, but in identity, feels like a breath being stolen from you mid-sentence. It's a moment that works because it doesn't just shock. It destabilizes the viewer's understanding of reality within the film. In literary terms, it's like the first paragraph of a book shifting under your eyes to say something entirely different than what you thought you read. From this point onward, we're not simply watching what happens, we're watching how the happening itself bends and refracts. The repetition of certain scenes, particularly ones involving pursuit or confrontation, becomes, paradoxically, more unnerving each time they occur. This isn't redundancy, it's a tightening noose. Each loop reveals variations in behavior, subtle changes in choice, as though testing whether a different decision might alter the outcome. This mirrors an almost mythic sensibility. Think of Sisyphus pushing his boulder, not because The Rock has changed, but because perhaps he might have, in some imperceptible way. That's the genius here. The repeated events aren't simply about plot mechanics. They're about exploring how much agency a person truly has when caught in the machinery of inevitability. Then comes the sequence that feels like the emotional fulcrum of the entire piece. The protagonist confronting a version of herself. The layers of meaning here are staggering. It's confrontation as survival tactic, confrontation as self-loathing, confrontation as desperate self-preservation. But on another level, it's the purest form of existential horror. What could be more frightening than meeting yourself and realizing you are both the victim and the villain? The physical stakes of the scene are high, but its emotional stakes are far greater, because they force the viewer to question the very nature of personal identity. If the you in front of you is capable of things you swore you'd never do, is that still you, or is it something your circumstances have shaped against your will? The quieter interludes, those moments between action, are just as vital. When she wanders through the ship's empty corridors, or stands staring at the vast ocean horizon, the pacing slows to let us feel the weight of isolation. These moments are the deep breaths before plunging underwater again, and they're critical to the film's emotional resonance. They give us the mental space to reflect, to feel the melancholy beneath the horror. This is where the film brushes against the poetic. The idea that being trapped in a loop is not just about fear or violence, but about the crushing loneliness of reliving the same pain without progress. As the narrative coils tighter and the full scope of the repetition becomes clear, there's an almost inevitable sense of dread. Not because we're waiting for the climax, but because we've begun to suspect that the climax is, itself, part of the loop. Here, the film reaches for something timeless. It's not simply about escape anymore. It's about the recognition that there is no escape in the conventional sense. And yet, within that recognition, there's an odd, aching beauty, because even if the events are doomed to repeat, the character still fights. There's a stubborn refusal to surrender to inevitability, and that's something deeply human. When the story moves to the final set of events, those that take place off the ship, we're pulled into an almost surreal sense of dislocation. We've been in the closed, echoing world of the vessel for so long that the sudden presence of ordinary daylight, streets, cars, and bystanders feels alien. But instead of breaking the spell, this shift deepens it. It's as though the ordinary world itself can't be trusted anymore, because we now understand that reality is not as linear or stable as it appears. This is where the film delivers its most gutting truths, not in a grand explosion of plot, but in the quiet, almost mundane moments that now carry unbearable weight because of what we know. One event in particular, small, almost unremarkable in execution, is like a final puzzle piece snapping into place. It's the point where the audience realizes that the cycle doesn't just end, it resets. And it resets with a cold inevitability that doesn't offer closure, only continuation. It's the narrative equivalent of a door closing softly, not to keep you safe inside, but to lock you into a room you've already tried to escape. From a critical perspective, this is where the film dares to be uncompromising. Many stories with looping structures offer some form of release, a lesson learned, a key discovered, a pattern broken. This one doesn't. Instead, it leaves us with the haunting possibility that some cycles are not meant to be broken, only endured. That endurance is where the emotional resonance lives. There's a quiet tragedy in watching a character fight with such persistence when, deep down, they may already suspect the futility of their struggle. And yet, isn't that the essence of the human condition? We push forward into uncertainty, into repetition, into hardship, because the alternative, surrender, is too unbearable to contemplate. The film takes that truth and strips it of comfort, showing us the fight without the victory, the loop without the exit. Critically, this choice has divided audiences. Some see it as bleak to the point of nihilism. Others find a strange comfort in its honesty. To me, it's neither entirely hopeless nor entirely consoling. It's simply a reflection of reality in its rawest form. Not every story ends with redemption. Not every pattern breaks. But there can still be meaning in the attempt, still a kind of dignity in refusing to go quietly. And perhaps that's why the significant events in this story resonate so deeply. They're not simply markers along a plot line. They're meditations on choice, consequence, and the fragile illusion of control. They remind us that life's most defining moments are often the ones we don't get to choose, and that our measure isn't in whether we escape them, but in how we move through them, even if we find ourselves there again and again. You'd think a film so deliberately atmospheric would have sprung fully formed from some high-budget machine, with massive crews, endless takes, and overflowing coffers. But in reality, it was the opposite, a small, tightly knit production where everyone had to stretch both creativity and resources to make the strange world come alive. It's almost poetic. A story about being trapped in a loop was itself made under the pressure of working within tight circles of time, budget, and location. One of the most fascinating details is how the ship, the looming, ominous setting that feels so eternal on-screen, was actually a composite of several different real-world spaces. Parts of it were genuine locations, aged and textured enough to give that creeping feeling of a place with a past. Other parts were painstakingly built on sound stages, designed to mimic reality, so well that even crew members reportedly got disoriented moving from one section to another. Imagine walking from a steel corridor with decades of wear and rust through a door, and finding yourself suddenly in a pristine studio where the walls can be shifted like puzzle pieces. That strange mix of real and constructed bled into the performances. Too, actors commented that the ship could sometimes feel alive, with its disjointed geography lending an almost dreamlike instability to scenes. There's also the matter of light, or more specifically, its absence. A huge part of the film's tension relies on the interplay of shadow and reflection, the way certain angles hide details until you're right on top of them. The cinematographer approached this with almost painterly precision. In interviews, he described spending hours adjusting a single beam of light, so it would skim across a bulkhead just enough to catch the edge of a character's face at the precise moment their expression shifted. And because they weren't working with an enormous lighting crew, much of this was achieved through trial, error, and patience rather than brute force equipment. That kind of intimacy with the craft shows it's not just lit, it's sculpted. One story that sticks with me involves the ocean scenes. Filming at sea is notoriously difficult. Wind, tide, and weather are rarely willing collaborators. There were days when the waves were so restless that carefully laid camera setups had to be abandoned, forcing the crew to improvise. At one point, a crucial shot of the boat approaching the mysterious vessel had to be reimagined entirely because the water refused to cooperate. Instead of pushing through and fighting nature, they leaned into the chaos, letting the roughness of the sea add to the sense of unease. In hindsight, it's perfect. You can feel that instability in the finished shot, like the ocean itself is complicit in the trap the characters are walking into. The cast's preparation was its own little odyssey. Because the story relies heavily on emotional precision, fear shading into determination, confusion blooming into realization, actors had to be in near constant communication about where in the loop their characters were at any given moment. Continuity wasn't just about props and costumes, it was about the psychology of repetition. One actor mentioned keeping a private notebook that mapped their emotional arc like a spiral, so they could find the exact right note of weariness, panic, or resignation no matter what order the scenes were shot in. That kind of invisible work is easy to overlook as an audience member, but it's what gives the performances their strange, cohesive power. And then there's the unspoken challenge of making a film about repetition without driving your audience, or your crew, mad in the process. Shooting the same scenes from slightly different angles, with subtly altered movements or dialogue, requires immense concentration. Some crew members joked that they started experiencing phantom loops during the production, walking into a room on set and swearing they'd already done this exact setup earlier that day, only to realize it was just the nature of the story bleeding into real life. The line between narrative and experience blurred, and in a way, that's a testament to how fully they all committed to the concept. One of the stranger production facts involves the film's sound design. Because so much of the tension is built from quiet spaces and subtle shifts, the team spent long days capturing the ambient noises of the ship in obsessive detail. They recorded the groan of metal under stress, the faint slap of water against the hull, the way footsteps echo differently on a graded floor versus a solid one. In the final mix, some of these sounds were exaggerated or layered with unexpected sources. Apparently, one of the most unsettling metallic creaks is actually a slowed-down recording of a door hinge from a completely unrelated location. It's the kind of manipulation that works subconsciously. You can't place what's wrong, but your brain knows it's not quite right. What I love most about these behind-the-scenes stories is how they reveal the film's DNA. Resourcefulness, precision, and a willingness to embrace imperfection when it served the mood. For example, the wardrobe department faced a curious problem. Because of the looping structure, certain costumes had to appear in pristine condition and in increasingly damaged states, often within the same shooting day. This meant that multiple versions of the same outfit were meticulously distressed by hand, with careful notes taken about each rip, stain, and smudge. And since scenes were rarely shot in chronological order, the team had to track these changes like forensic scientists. One misplaced stain could break the illusion, so the attention to detail bordered on obsessive. But that's exactly the level of care that makes the finished product so seamless. There's also a human warmth to the production that might surprise people given the film's tone. Between takes, the cast reportedly kept the atmosphere light, sharing jokes and small comforts to offset the intensity of the scenes. One crew member recalled a day when a particularly heavy moment was followed by the entire set breaking into laughter over an unplanned blooper. An actor flubbing a line in such a wildly out-of-character way that it deflated the tension completely. That balance of focus and levity was essential. Without it, the relentless atmosphere could have been emotionally exhausting. And speaking of unexpected levity, there's a quirky fact about the ship's clocks. If you look closely in some shots, you might notice that certain clocks are either frozen at a specific time or ticking in ways that don't match reality. This wasn't an accident. The set dressers intentionally played with timepieces to reinforce the sense of temporal instability, even in moments when the audience might not consciously notice. It's a subtle detail, but it's exactly the kind of hidden texture that rewards repeat viewing. Another fascinating aspect is how the director approached the script during shooting. While the core structure was meticulously planned, certain beats were left open for exploration on set. If a scene began to feel too predictable, they'd tweak blocking, shift the timing of a reveal, or experiment with different camera placements to keep the energy alive. In a story where inevitability is a theme, that flexibility in the creative process is almost ironic, but it's also what keeps the film feeling alive rather than mechanical. The music, too, has its own behind-the-scenes quirks. The composer reportedly worked closely with the editor, adjusting cues to align with the rhythms of the loop structure. In some cases, musical motifs were subtly altered each time they recurred, so the audience would feel an almost imperceptible shift, familiar, but not identical. It's a small touch, but it mirrors the story's core conceit beautifully. Even the weather played a role in shaping the film's final form. Some of the most atmospheric cloudscapes and lighting shifts weren't planned. They were gifts from unpredictable conditions. The production schedule had to bend around sudden storms, but rather than fight it, they embraced those moments, using the raw, moody skies to amplify the film's tone. One overcast afternoon in particular resulted in shots so naturally eerie that they barely required color grading in post-production. Looking back on all of these production details, what strikes me most is how the film's strange, looping soul was already present in the way it was made. The crew lived in their own miniature cycle of repetition, rebuilding sets, reshooting variations, retracing steps both literally and narratively. They chased perfection in light and shadow, sound and silence, but they also learned to surrender to the unpredictable. The sea, the weather, the quirks of human energy. It's easy to watch the finished story and think of it as a closed, immovable thing, every frame deliberate, every moment inevitable. But knowing the behind-the-scenes truths gives it another dimension. You start to see the fingerprints of the people who built it. The cinematographer hunched over a light meter, the wardrobe artist carefully tearing fabric along a marked seam, the director pausing to let a moment breathe before calling action. You see not just the story, but the making of the story, and that somehow makes it even more haunting. Some films whisk you away to places that feel like postcards, sunlit streets, golden fields, picturesque skylines. This is not that kind of story. The world here is not a place you dream of visiting, but one you stumble into when you've taken the wrong turn and can't quite retrace your steps. It's both familiar and alien, real and unreal, a space that keeps pulling you in while quietly making you wish for the safety of an exit that never arrives. When I think about the settings in this film, I don't just see them, I feel them in the pit of my stomach. There's the early light of a coastal morning, shimmering on restless water, carrying the promise of an ordinary day. But even here, before the storm, the air seems a bit too heavy. The brightness doesn't comfort, it blinds. The horizon isn't wide open but instead feels like the edge of a stage, where something unseen waits in the wings. It's the kind of day where you start to notice small, wrong details. A seagull's cry that sounds more like a warning than a call, the slight metallic tang of salt air laced with something sour, a stillness in the water that's not quite right. The ocean is the first and most persistent setting, and it's a character in its own right. Not a sparkling postcard sea, but a shifting, restless expanse that's never quite at ease. Its surface alternates between a sheet of glass and a field of black, chopped by wind. It's the place where movement becomes meaningless. You can speed ahead for hours and still feel like you're exactly where you started. The filmmakers didn't romanticize it. Instead, they leaned into its endlessness, its ability to unsettle. Long, wide shots stretch out the water until it seems eternal. The sound design picks up its low, steady growl, letting it seep into your bones like a distant drumbeat you can't escape. Then there's the storm, a sudden, violent interruption that transforms the sea from indifferent to hostile. It comes not with the grace of cinema's typical storms, but with a kind of chaotic urgency. The sky closes in, heavy with bruised clouds that seem to press the horizon down into the waves. The light shifts abruptly, colors draining from the scene as if the world itself is recoiling. Cinematography here becomes a language of disorientation. Tilted camera angles, rapid cuts between perspectives, a contrast of bright lightning and oppressive dark. You don't watch the storm. You're inside it, your bearings stripped away with each crash of water. And then, just as the chaos reaches its peak, the sea stills again, but not in any reassuring way. The horizon clears, and from the mist emerges the vessel that will become the true heart of this film's setting. Calling it a ship feels too simple. It's a labyrinth of steel and shadow, a place that swallows sound and seems to watch you back. Its size is imposing, but what unsettles you most is its silence. No engines, no voices, no signs of life, and yet it feels inhabited. The camera lingers on its sharp lines and long corridors, giving you time to take in the unsettling symmetry, the repetition of shapes that makes you doubt your sense of direction before you've even stepped inside. The ship's interiors are a masterclass in mood building through setting. Hallways stretch too far, their repeating patterns of doors and lights creating a hypnotic effect. The lighting is dim, filtered through grimy fixtures that hum faintly, as if tired of their own glow. Colors are muted browns, grays, the dull green of aged metal, and they wrap everything in a kind of heavy quiet. Even in wide shots, there's a sense of claustrophobia. The frame seems to press inward, making each corridor feel narrower than the last. This isn't just a backdrop, it's an active participant in the story's tension. What's brilliant is how the ship's geography plays tricks on you. You start to notice that rooms repeat, hallways lead you back to where you started, and familiar landmarks appear in unfamiliar places. It's a visual loop that mirrors the story's structure without ever needing to be explained. The cinematography reinforces this through repeated camera movements, tracking shots down corridors you've already traveled, only now from a slightly different angle, just enough to make you question whether you've actually seen this space before. Even the open decks of the ship aren't truly open. The railings might suggest freedom, but the sea below feels less like escape and more like a barrier, vast and indifferent. The light here is harsh, reflecting off the steel in ways that make everything feel overexposed, almost sterile. It's as if the outside air can't reach you. You're breathing something stale, recycled, just enough to keep you alive but never refreshed. The film's visual language thrives on contrast. Harsh daylight on the water gives way to the dim, artificial glow of the ship's interiors. Wide shots that make you feel small against the ocean dissolve into tight close-ups where the frame cuts off escape routes, focusing only on faces, hands, weapons, and keys, small objects that suddenly seem to hold enormous weight. The camera never lets you forget where you are, but it also never lets you feel entirely certain about the space you're in. One of the most unsettling aspects of the setting is its emptiness. The absence of people doesn't make it peaceful. It makes it feel as if something just happened here, and whatever it was might still be lurking. Chairs are pushed back from tables, plates are set but untouched, hallways are too clean. It's that uncanny stillness of a place designed for human presence but stripped of it, a haunted vacancy that suggests you're always arriving just after the action. And yet, the film doesn't treat these settings as static. They shift subtly and sometimes alarmingly over the course of the story. A hallway might be exactly as you saw it before, but now there's a smear of blood on the wall. A dining room that once felt eerily pristine is now in disarray. The repetition is never perfect, it's always fractured just enough to keep you alert, scanning for differences that might explain what's happening. That tension between familiarity and distortion is what makes the setting so unnerving. Cinematography here isn't just about showing the space, it's about using the space to show what the characters are feeling. When disorientation takes over, the camera tilts or moves in ways that break spatial logic. When a character feels cornered, the frame tightens, cutting off any sense of the room's edges, so that all you can see is their trapped body language. The visual style is an extension of the characters' minds. The more unmoored they become, the more the shots fracture and repeat. Lighting is used almost like a narrative device. Early on, natural light dominates, sunlight bouncing off water, clouds shifting overhead. But once inside the ship, the light becomes artificial, controlled, and in some ways oppressive. There's a sense that the sun doesn't penetrate here, that you've stepped into a pocket of reality cut off from the natural world. Even when the characters return to the deck, the light feels different, flatter, less alive, as if the world beyond the ship has been dulled by whatever force controls this place. Sound plays an equally vital role in shaping the setting. The low hum of the ship, the echo of footsteps, the distant metallic creaks, all combine to create an audio landscape that's as important as the visuals. Sometimes the sound is amplified beyond realism, a footstep ringing louder than it should, a creak stretching out just a bit too long, pulling you deeper into the unease. Other times, sound drops away entirely, leaving you in a vacuum that feels almost unbearable. The silence here isn't empty. It's charged, as if the space itself is holding its breath. There are moments when the setting seems almost sentient. The way doors close just as a character approaches, or how certain objects appear exactly where they're needed, as if placed there by unseen hands. The ship feels like a puzzle that's constantly rearranging itself, responding to the actions of those inside it. That quality turns every hallway into a question, every staircase into a potential trap. Even the smallest visual choices add layers to the mood. The color palette leans heavily on desaturated tones, draining vibrancy from the world until it feels just a step removed from reality. This muted look makes the occasional flash of bright color, blood on metal, a piece of clothing in the wrong place, stand out with almost violent clarity. It's not just aesthetic, it's psychological, forcing your attention to moments the story once burned into your memory. The editing rhythm also shapes how you experience the setting. Long takes allow the geography to seep in, letting you notice repeating patterns and subtle changes. Then, in moments of danger or confusion, cuts become faster, breaking your mental map and making you feel just as lost as the characters. This push and pull between orientation and disorientation keeps the setting from ever becoming background. It's always active, always influencing how you feel. And perhaps the most remarkable thing is how these locations, real or constructed, never feel like movie sets. There's a grit to them, a lived-in texture that makes you believe they existed long before the characters arrived and will continue long after they're gone. You can almost smell the salt rusting the metal, feel the grime on the railings, hear the way sound changes when you move from open deck to narrow hall. By the end, the setting has become inseparable from the story's themes. It's not just a place where events happen, it's a mirror for the characters' internal states, a labyrinth that traps both body and mind. The sea's endless horizon becomes the visual metaphor for inevitability, the ship's repeating corridors for cycles that can't be broken. The cinematography, lighting, and sound work together to make sure you don't just see these places. You inhabit them, feel their weight, and carry them with you long after the story is done. If you've ever wondered what it's like to be part of a film where the story itself is a maze, imagine the energy on a set where everyone knows they're making something that bends space, time, and audience perception into knots. The atmosphere wasn't the frantic chaos you might expect from a production that involves storms, vast ocean scenes, and a sprawling ship. Though there were moments of that, too, it was something more intimate, almost conspiratorial. People moved like they were in on a secret, as if the set itself held whispers only they could hear. And maybe it did. The production didn't take place in one single location, of course. The ocean sequences, those sweeping and sometimes punishingly intense scenes on the water, demanded careful planning. You can't just drop a cast and crew into open sea and hope for the best. Well, you can, but it's frowned upon unless you're aiming for disaster or a very expensive rescue mission. They used a combination of controlled coastal waters, tank work, and skillful camera trickery to create that endless expanse. The actors, though, were often working in very real conditions. Damp clothes clinging to them, sea spray stinging their eyes, and that constant rocking motion under their feet that no soundstage can perfectly replicate. One of the most unexpectedly difficult parts was maintaining continuity when the weather insisted on having its own personality. There were days when the wind was so cooperative it might as well have been a member of the crew, holding its breath for takes. And there were others when it howled, whipped hair into faces, and rattled equipment so loudly you could practically hear the boom operators muttering to themselves. The The cinematographers had to adapt constantly. Angles changed, blocking adjusted, lenses swapped to deal with shifting light. The storm sequence was one of the largest logistical challenges. It involved rigged rain machines, wind generators, and an almost symphonic coordination between departments. Picture a team of grips hauling hoses that sprayed down cast and set alike, while enormous fans roared like jet engines, blasting water in every direction. The actors had to hit marks they couldn't even see, their eyes squinting through rain that wasn't just pouring, it was practically attacking them. And yet they managed to deliver performances that felt like raw panic, even as they knew there was a safety team just out of frame, ready to step in. Inside the ship, the atmosphere changed entirely. The corridors and rooms were constructed with meticulous detail, down to the scuffed paint on the walls and the rusted edges of door frames. But unlike a static set, these spaces had to be modular. Walls could be removed to accommodate cameras, lighting rigs, and crew movement. There was a certain kind of choreography to shooting in these spaces. Actors and crew weaving around each other in impossibly tight quarters, sound operators contorting to stay out of the frame, camera operators moving backwards while trusting someone to guide them so they didn't slam into a wall. The interactions between cast members in these confined sets were part of what made the on-screen chemistry feel so real. When you're working in close quarters for long stretches, you either become very close friends or you learn the fine art of polite avoidance. Here it was the former. Between takes, you'd find them leaning against the same bulkheads they'd been sprinting past minutes before, sharing stories, swapping snacks, or laughing over the surreal nature of the dialogue they were rehearsing. The absurdity of the plot, its loops, its strange repetitions, sometimes struck them mid-rehearsal, and you'd hear stifled laughter give way to full-blown grins before the director called for focus. One of the surprising joys of the shoot was how many little improvisations made their way into the final film. A glance here, a pause there, sometimes born from necessity, like when a prop didn't work quite as planned, or when an actor took an extra beat to steady themselves in a swaying corridor. Instead of cutting these moments, the director embraced them, knowing they added authenticity. It gave the finished work that strange, almost lived-in quality, as though we were peering into something organic rather than staged. There were, of course, less glamorous moments. Filming long hours under hot lights in the ship interiors meant the air grew thick, even with fans running between takes. The sound of those fans had to be killed during filming, which meant everyone was suddenly very aware of how warm it really was. Crew members developed a kind of silent communication for passing water bottles around or slipping someone a cooling towel without breaking the mood of the scene. In those moments, the camaraderie between departments was everything. Gaffers helping costume assistants, camera operators helping with set dressing when time was short. The director had a very particular vision for the way the ship's geography would play into the story's disorientation. That meant the crew had to be careful about how each section of the set was dressed and lit, ensuring that when spaces reappeared, they felt just slightly, but importantly different. This required a meticulous tracking system. The set decorators kept detailed photographs and notes for every single object in each shot. Move a chair just 2 inches, and it could change the emotional weight of a scene. The prop department became experts at both precision and subtle manipulation. The sound department faced their own strange challenge, creating an atmosphere that was both natural and unnervingly heightened. They captured an extensive library of creaks, groans, and metallic echoes from the actual set, then manipulated them in post-production to make the ship feel alive. Some of the sounds were real recordings slowed down or layered so subtly you couldn't pinpoint their source, but they added that subconscious unease that keeps audiences hooked. One anecdote that floated around the set involved a scene where a character walks alone down a hallway, hearing faint footsteps behind them. The actor swore they heard footsteps during one take when no one else was supposed to be there, not even a crew member. The sound team later revealed they'd been experimenting with playing pre-recorded noises through hidden speakers on set to help the actors react naturally. The result was so convincing that even those in on the trick admitted it gave them goosebumps. There were also moments when the cast and crew's shared exhaustion worked in their favor. Shooting a scene late at night after a long day meant the bleary-eyed, slightly unsteady energy you see on screen wasn't faked. Those heavy blinks, the slower reaction times, they were real. And in a film where reality and repetition blur, that authenticity fed directly into the tone. Perhaps the most heartwarming behind-the-scenes detail is that the empty nature of the ship in the story didn't extend to real life. Between takes, the set was anything but silent. There was laughter, there were running jokes about the maze-like corridors, there were impromptu games of how fast can you get lost during breaks. Crew members pranked each other by rearranging small props or subtly altering signs on doors, knowing it would confuse someone later. The irony of deliberately getting lost in a set designed to make you feel lost was never wasted on them. The storm days, those exhausting, waterlogged shoots, were often followed by lighter interior days, and you could feel the collective sigh of relief. Those were the days when the costume department waged its quiet battle against damp fabric, carefully drying and reshaping clothes so they'd look as they did in earlier scenes. Wardrobe continuity is an invisible art, but on a film with so much repetition, it was absolutely crucial. In the end, the behind-the-scenes life of this production mirrored its story in strange ways. The looping corridors, the repeating locations, the feeling of déjà vu, they weren't just in the script. Cast and crew lived them, day after day, until the set felt like a second home that somehow kept changing on them. The challenges, weather that wouldn't cooperate, technical issues in cramped spaces, the constant vigilance over continuity, became part of the rhythm. And just as in the film, it was the relationships between the people inside this strange, constructed world that made it all hold together. When they finally wrapped, the ship, silent and still, felt almost too quiet. The laughter was gone, the lights dimmed, the props packed away. But for those who'd spent weeks inside its twisting halls, it had left its mark. Not just as a set, but as a place they'd inhabited together, a labyrinth of steel, light, and sound that they'd navigated until they knew it better than some real places in their lives. Some films entertain you, others move you, and then there are those rare ones that sit inside your mind like a slow-turning gear, clicking into place days, sometimes weeks after you've watched them. This one belongs in that last category. It doesn't just tell a story, it weaves an intricate tapestry of ideas, patterns, and whispers between the lines. Watching it isn't so much a passive experience as it is a quiet collaboration. You lean in, it leans back, and somewhere in the exchange, you start to realize it's speaking in a language that's part narrative, part dream logic. One of the most persistent undercurrents is the theme of inevitability. Not just fate in the broad, romanticized sense, but the suffocating kind, the type that feels like a tightening knot you can't loosen no matter how much you pull. It's baked into the structure of the story itself, where events seem to spiral and repeat, creating the unsettling impression that no amount of willpower or quick thinking can rewrite what's already been written. Characters don't simply make choices. They walk along pre-carved grooves in the floor, grooves that seem to have been worn down by countless others before them. What makes this theme so quietly devastating is how personal it feels. There's a certain reflection of life here, how we often find ourselves returning to the same mistakes, the same patterns of behavior, as though our own histories are loops we can't quite escape. In the film's world, this inevitability is tangible, physical, almost mechanical in how it operates. But the emotional truth behind it resonates because we've all felt it. That eerie déjà vu of living a moment you swore you'd never repeat. Alongside inevitability is the thorny thread of guilt. A guilt so deeply embedded it shapes every choice, every twitch of a character's face. Here, guilt isn't treated as a single incident to be atoned for. It's more like a haunting presence that attaches itself to a person and follows them, reshaping their reality. The way it's depicted is almost architectural. It builds corridors, closes doors, turns corners into dead ends. The very space the characters inhabit begins to feel like an externalization of that guilt. Endless, repetitive, and just claustrophobic enough to keep them circling back. This is where the film's symbolism starts to work in ways that are both blatant and sly. Take the ship itself. It's more than just a setting, it's a metaphorical construct. On the surface, it's a place of eerie emptiness, echoing footsteps and strange angles. But beneath that, it becomes an embodiment of psychological entrapment. The way its hallways and stairwells seem to lead back to where you started mirrors the cyclical nature of regret. The exhausting reality that you can leave one room in your mind only to find yourself back in it, no matter which way you turn. Then there's the recurring image of mirrors, sometimes literal, sometimes implied through parallel actions and repeated gestures. Mirrors in this context aren't about vanity, they're about confrontation. They're a way of forcing the characters, and by extension us, into facing the uncomfortable truth that we are both the hero and the villain in our own lives. In one moment, you're the person desperately trying to survive. In another, you're the architect of the very nightmare you're running from. The ocean, too, carries its own layered meaning. It's vast and infinite, yes, but here it's also oddly featureless, a liquid void stretching in every direction. It becomes the perfect visual metaphor for uncertainty and the loss of orientation. On open water, there are no landmarks, no fixed points, just endless blue that offers no real sense of progress or escape. In that sense, the ocean is the emotional landscape of the story. Beautiful, yes, but also merciless and disorienting. And then there's time, the most slippery theme of all. Time in this story isn't linear. It's fluid, folding back on itself like a ribbon caught in the wind. Events echo each other, sometimes subtly, sometimes blatantly, blurring the line between cause and effect. This elasticity of time forces you to reconsider what it even means to act. If you can't change the outcome, does the act of choosing still matter? Or is choice just an illusion the mind clings to in order to make the loop bearable? From a symbolic standpoint, the repetition of certain events works like a recurring motif in music. Each time you hear it, it's slightly altered, an extra note here, a missing note there, changing its emotional impact. Sometimes it's quieter, almost background. Other times it's center stage, impossible to ignore. This mirrors the way memory itself functions. We revisit moments in our heads, but they're never exactly the same as they were. Details shift, colors change, and yet the core of them remains stubbornly intact. Even the smallest objects carry symbolic weight. Items that seem mundane, a piece of clothing, a weapon, a dropped trinket, become markers, breadcrumbs in the labyrinth. They're not just props, they're emotional triggers, reminders that the present is stitched together from countless versions of the past. Each one is a quiet nod to the fact that even in a world where events seem set in stone, the human mind will cling to symbols as proof of its own agency. Another thread running through everything is isolation. Physical isolation, certainly, characters often find themselves alone in vast or labyrinthine spaces. But also the deeper, more insidious isolation of knowing that no one else can truly share your experience. Even when characters are together, there's a sense of disconnection, as though each one is walking their own parallel path. This connects back to the broader themes of guilt and inevitability. Some burdens, the film suggests, are carried alone, no matter how many people are in the room with you. This isolation becomes even sharper when paired with the recurring motif of doubling, characters encountering versions of themselves, either directly or through mirrored actions. On one level, this doubling feeds into the eerie, almost supernatural tone of the story. On another, it's deeply human. We all carry different versions of ourselves, past selves, imagined future selves, the self we show the world, and the self we keep hidden. Seeing those versions side by side is disorienting, even horrifying, because it strips away the comforting illusion that we're a single, unified whole. There's also an undercurrent of punishment and penance woven through the events. The repetition of certain scenarios begins to feel less like chance and more like ritual, an unending cycle designed to force the characters to confront the consequences of their actions. It's as if the world itself has become a judge and jury, sentencing them to relive their worst moments until some unspoken debt is paid. But the question, of course, is whether that debt can be paid, or whether the act of trying is the punishment itself. Cinematically, the film reinforces its themes through the way it's shot. Long tracking shots mimic the act of searching, as though the camera is trying to find an exit from the loop alongside the characters. The repeated visual compositions, frames that echo earlier scenes, create a subconscious recognition in the viewer, a sense that we've been here before even if we can't quite place when. This repetition in the visual language becomes part of the storytelling, a symbolic reminder that in this world, paths inevitably lead back to their starting point. One of the most quietly brilliant uses of symbolism comes from the way light and shadow are used aboard the ship. Brightness is often harsh and unflattering, revealing too much, while shadows offer false comfort, hiding dangers that are all too real. This duality reflects the nature of truth in the story. Sometimes seeing clearly is more painful than staying in the dark, and sometimes the shadows you retreat to are where the real threats wait. In the end, what makes the themes and symbolism so effective is how they're interlaced with the emotional core of the story. They're not academic exercises layered on top for intellectual satisfaction. They're lived truths for the characters. The inevitability isn't just a structural gimmick, it's a lived nightmare. The guilt isn't just an abstract idea, it's the fuel for every desperate decision. The isolation isn't a mood-setting choice. It's the fundamental state of being for people trapped in cycles they can't explain, much less escape. When all of these elements converge, the film becomes something more than a puzzle. It's not simply about figuring out what's happening. It's about feeling the weight of what's happening. The symbolism enriches the experience not by giving you answers, but by deepening the questions, leaving you with the uneasy sense that maybe, just maybe, the loops we see on screen aren't confined to the screen at all. They live in us, too, in our habits, our regrets, and the quiet spaces between our choices. You notice it right away in the way the camera moves, or sometimes doesn't. Long, deliberate tracking shots follow characters through narrow hallways, letting us feel the weight of their footsteps and the claustrophobia of the space. It's not just about showing where they're going. It's about making us feel like we're walking with them, unable to speed up, unable to turn away. The stiller moments when the camera lingers on a detail, a swinging rope, a distant corridor, the restless surface of the ocean, pull us into that in-between space where tension thrives. In those moments, you can almost hear your own heartbeat, because the film gives you just enough silence for it to echo. What's especially clever is how the cinematography uses perspective to play with our sense of certainty. Shots are framed so that you're never quite sure what's in the background or lurking at the edge. The camera might hold on a character's face for a beat too long, letting your eyes wander into the blurred space behind them, where your imagination starts filling in possibilities. Other times, it follows someone from behind, their figure taking up most of the frame, so that any sudden shift in focus, a movement in the periphery, a shadow that wasn't there a moment ago, feels like a jolt. This constant dance between what's shown and what's hidden becomes part of the film's language. The use of light is its own kind of storytelling. On the ship, the lighting shifts from muted natural tones to harsher, almost metallic glare, depending on where the characters are. In open spaces, the light feels washed out, almost sterile, amplifying the emptiness. In tighter spaces, shadows claim corners and stretch along walls, swallowing depth and making the ship feel less like a place and more like a living maze. It's as if the environment itself has moods, sometimes indifferent, sometimes hostile. Sound design, though, is where the film truly hooks into your nerves. There's a delicate layering of diegetic and non-diegetic sounds, the creak of metal under strain, the hum of unseen machinery, the rhythmic crash of waves against the hull. These aren't just background noise, they're part of the film's pulse. Often they rise just enough to blur into the score, creating this uneasy hybrid of reality and atmosphere. The music itself doesn't overplay its hand. There are no swelling orchestral bursts to dictate your emotions. Instead, it's sparse, almost skeletal, letting small dissonances creep in like intrusive thoughts. You're left listening for something that never fully arrives, and that's exactly the point. Editing plays a sly role in reinforcing the story's cyclical nature. Cuts are made in such a way that certain movements, gestures, or frames seem to echo earlier ones, even when they technically occur later. You'll notice a character turning their head in a particular way, and something in your brain nudges you. Haven't I seen this before? That repeated visual rhythm doesn't just keep the audience off balance. It becomes a symbolic thread, mirroring the story's themes of recurrence and inevitability. Transitions are often abrupt, too, snapping from one location to another without the usual cinematic cushioning. This disorientation keeps you alert, wary, and engaged. One technique that really stands out is how the film uses depth of field. Foregrounds are sometimes kept razor-sharp while backgrounds melt into softness, pulling our attention to a single detail: a hand gripping a railing, a small object on the floor. Other times, it flips, letting the foreground fall out of focus so that our eyes are forced to scan the blurred mid-distance, searching for shapes that might mean danger. It's a quiet, almost subconscious way of keeping us active participants, never allowing us to just sit back and watch. When it comes to visual continuity, the filmmakers seem to intentionally play with imperfections. Objects reappear or vanish, not in a way that feels sloppy, but in a way that makes you second-guess your own perception. It's as though the editing is conspiring with the narrative to unsettle you, creating small cracks in the reality of the film that mirror the characters' own experiences. You're not just watching them lose their grip, you're feeling your own grip loosen right alongside them. The camera work is unflashy in the best possible way. There are no gratuitous crane shots or dizzying spins just to prove they can do them. Instead, the movements feel motivated by the characters' emotional states, sometimes fluid and steady when there's a brief sense of control, sometimes jittery and handheld when panic takes over. In moments of high tension, the camera gets close enough to make you feel like you're intruding, like you're too near to someone's private unraveling. In terms of atmosphere, the editing and sound design work together like two hands weaving the same rope. Imagine a scene where a character is running down a hallway. The sound of their footsteps doesn't just sync with their movements. It almost overlaps with the ambient groans of the ship until you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. Then, just as they stop, the sound cuts out abruptly, leaving you in a pocket of silence that feels unnatural. Those moments of sudden quiet are some of the film's most nerve-wracking. Because they're so rare, they demand your full attention. The practical production choices also feed into the overall tone. The set design is meticulous. The ship's interiors are not generic or interchangeable, but distinct in a way that makes navigation feel possible yet strangely disorienting. Hallways have just enough similarity to create confusion, but the details, the color of a wall panel, the placement of a vent, are specific enough to make you wonder if you've actually been here before. It's a clever production trick that supports the story's looping, repetitive structure without ever making it too obvious. Interestingly, the film doesn't rely heavily on visual effects. The few that appear are understated, grounded in the reality of the scene rather than calling attention to themselves. This restraint keeps the story anchored in a tangible world, which is essential when the narrative itself is so conceptually slippery. If the visuals had tipped too far into the stylized or fantastical, the whole experience might have floated away from its grounded psychological core. As for the box office side of things, the film's production was modest by Hollywood standards, and that worked in its favor. Without the pressure of a blockbuster budget, the filmmakers could lean into atmosphere and craft rather than spectacle. The marketing didn't promise explosions or high-concept effects. It positioned the film as something more intimate and cerebral, a mystery to be experienced rather than consumed. That approach, while perhaps limiting its immediate commercial reach, has given it longevity as a cult favorite. Viewers who found it didn't just watch it, they carried it with them, recommending it quietly, almost possessively, to others who might appreciate its peculiar rhythms. The way the production balanced ambition with constraint is one of its quiet triumphs. Every element, camera, sound, editing, design, works not as a showcase of individual skill, but as a collective effort to serve the story's unsettling emotional truth. In that sense, the film feels like a finely tuned instrument. Nothing extra, nothing missing, every part vibrating in harmony with the rest. And perhaps that's the real magic here. You don't leave the theater marveling at a single dazzling shot or a particularly clever edit. You leave with the feeling the film gave you, a feeling carefully built from dozens of small, deliberate choices that, together, make the world on screen feel as inescapable as the one the characters are trapped in. That's not an accident. That's the craft of filmmaking at its most quietly confident.